Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Forgotten Puppeteer. Holly Arnold had always found solace in the quiet corners of the Isle of Wight. The island, nestled between sea and sky, had a way of comforting her restless spirit. She had moved there to escape the noise of the world, leaving behind the clamor of a failed relationship and a crumbling career. An artist by nature, Holly had inherited her grandmother's love for puppetry, a dying art she hoped to revive in her secluded life by the sea. It was in the attic of her grandmother's cottage, tucked behind layers of dust and forgotten memories, that Holly discovered the marionette. It was a peculiar thing, delicate but unsettling. Its body was crafted from worn, pale wood, weathered by time, with limbs that seemed far too long for its frame. The face was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, with sharp, angular features and eyes painted in a shade of deep, unnatural black. The puppet seemed to stare at her, its fixed smile unsettling in the dim light of the attic. On the back of its wooden skull an engraving read, Emmeline, 1893. The name tugged at the corners of Holly's mind, though she couldn't recall her grandmother ever mentioning it. There was something familiar yet unsettling about the marionette, as if it had been waiting all this time. Holly took Emmeline downstairs, eager to explore its artistry. Over the next few weeks, she spent hours cleaning and restoring the marionette, carefully rethreading the strings and polishing its wooden joints. It was exquisite, but there was something deeply off about it. She couldn't shake the feeling that Emmeline was watching her, those painted eyes tracking her every move. One night, after a particularly long day of restoration, Holly decided to test Emmeline's strings. She stood in her small living room, the sea crashing against the cliffs outside, and began to move the marionette. With each pull of the thread, Emmeline danced. Her limbs moved fluidly, unnaturally so, as if she were more alive than Holly had expected. But as Holly worked the strings, something strange happened. Emmeline seemed to resist. Her movements no longer mirrored Holly's intentions. The puppet's limbs jerked as if they had a will of their own, twitching in a macabre dance that Holly had not directed. The marionette's head tilted upward, those black eyes locking onto Holly's, and the wooden lips seemed to part just slightly, just enough for Holly to feel the room grow colder. Startled, Holly dropped the strings, the marionette collapsing in a heap on the floor. She stepped back, heart racing, trying to rationalize what she had just witnessed. It had to be her imagination, fatigue playing tricks on her. But over the next few days, things grew worse. The air in her cottage felt heavy, as if something unseen lurked just out of sight. At night, Holly would hear the faintest creak of wood, the sound of something shifting in the darkness. The marionette, though still on the shelf where she had left it, seemed to change positions when she wasn't looking. Its eyes followed her, no matter where she stood in the room. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, Holly found herself unable to resist the pull of the marionette. She sat down in front of it, her hands trembling as she lifted the strings. This time she felt a connection, as though the puppet were more than just an object, it was a part of her. As she moved Emmeline, she felt a strange sensation creeping over her, like something dark and ancient was stirring within her mind. She no longer felt in control of the marionette. Instead, Emmeline moved of her own accord, forcing Holly's hands to follow. The dance became frantic, violent. Holly's heart pounded as her body moved in sync with the puppet, her thoughts clouding with images she could not recognize. Then the visions came. They started as flashes, fragments of memories that weren't her own. She saw a woman, pale and gaunt, standing in the same cottage, her hand working the strings of Emmeline with a wild look in her eyes. The woman was mumbling something under her breath, words Holly couldn't quite make out. Then the woman was no longer in control, Emmeline was. The puppet's eyes were alive with malice as it forced the woman to act out terrible things. Holly saw blood, a darkened room, in the woman's hands, shaking as they held something sharp. The vision snapped away, and Holly was left gasping. She dropped the strings, her body trembling. Emmeline slumped, lifeless once again, but Holly could feel the weight of the marionette's presence in the room. It was watching her. It wanted something. Terrified, Holly tried to lock Emmeline away. She shoved the marionette into her trunk, burying it beneath all blankets and heavy books. But it didn't matter. The strange occurrences persisted. The creaking of wood at night grew louder, the footsteps on the floorboards unmistakable. The feeling of being watched turned into something worse. Holly now felt as though Emmeline was no longer waiting. The puppet was moving. It was trying to get to her. Late one stormy night, the breaking point came. Holly awoke to the sound of the trunk being dragged across the floor. She bolted upright in bed, her breath catching in her throat. The door to her bedroom creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Emmeline. No strings, no handler. The marionette stood on its own, its wooden body twisted into a grotesque mockery of a human's dance. Holly tried to scream, but no sound came out. Emmeline's eyes gleamed in the darkness, her painted smile widening unnaturally. With slow, deliberate steps, the puppet moved toward her. Holly scrambled out of bed, but her legs felt heavy, her mind clouded. She could feel Emmeline's presence inside her head, controlling her like a puppet on invisible strings. The marionette's hand reached for her, cold wood brushing against Holly's skin. And then, in a voice that wasn't hers, Holly whispered, "Dance." Holly's body moved without her command, her limbs jerking in a grotesque dance that mimicked the movements of the marionette. She could feel herself slipping away, her mind sinking into the same dark place that had consumed the woman in her visions. As her body twisted and contorted, Holly realized the truth. Emmeline wasn't just a puppet. She was a vessel, a conduit for something far more sinister. The marionette was alive, feeding off the darkest desires of those who dared to touch her strings. And now it had found a new master. Holly's last conscious thought, as her body danced in the moonlit room, was of the name carved into the marionette's skull, Emmeline. A name long forgotten, a woman lost to time, just as Holly would soon be. The next morning, the villagers found Holly's cottage abandoned. The door was ajar, the house eerily silent. Inside, they found no trace of her, only a marionette sitting neatly on the shelf, its wooden hands poised delicately, and its painted black eyes glinting with a secret it would never tell. And somewhere deep within the puppet, Holly danced. Forever. Days passed, and Holly Arnold became the subject of whispers among the locals on the Isle of Wight. She had always been somewhat of a recluse, but her sudden disappearance stirred rumors. Some speculated she had simply left, seeking a life elsewhere. Others, especially the older folk who had lived on the island for generations, knew better. The cottage she had inherited from her grandmother had always held an air of mystery. They recalled the stories the ones told in hushed tones about the woman who had once lived there before Holly's grandmother, Emmeline Grey. She had been a puppeteer of local fame, performing at festivals and gatherings. Her puppets were said to be enchanted, their movements so lifelike they seemed to be breathing, watching, waiting. Emmeline had lived alone, and when she vanished one night without a trace, the tales of her witchcraft spread like wildfire. Her marionettes were scattered, sold off, or buried deep, though one was never found, her masterpiece Emmeline. The islanders hadn't spoken the name in years, and most had dismissed it as superstition. But as the days turned into weeks and Holly's absence became more apparent, the old stories resurfaced. Weeks later, a young historian named Mark Whiston arrived on the Isle of Wight, eager to investigate Holly's sudden disappearance. Mark had a fascination with local legends and unsolved mysteries, and Holly's case had caught his attention. Her cottage had become infamous overnight, drawing in curious onlookers, but no one dared to enter. The rumors about the marionette, passed down through generations, were enough to keep even the bravest at bay. Mark, however, didn't believe in curses or haunted dolls. He saw Holly's disappearance as a puzzle to be solved, not a ghost story. The locals reluctantly gave him directions to the cottage, though they warned him to stay away. He thanked them, but paid little heed to their warnings, dismissing their tales as exaggerated folklore. When Mark reached the cottage, the air around it felt different, thicker, as though the atmosphere itself was weighed down by something unseen. The windows were dusty, the garden overgrown, and the front door slightly ajar. Mark hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. The interior was just as Holly had left it. Dust coated the surfaces, and a faint scent of salt water and old wood lingered in the air. The only sound was the distant crash of the sea against the cliffs. Mark walked through the house, taking in the worn furniture and the scattered signs of Holly's life, half-finished sketches, notes, and old marionette strings. It was clear she had been working on something. Then, in the corner of the living room, Mark saw it, the marionette. It sat on the shelf, its black eyes staring straight ahead, its wooden limbs poised delicately. There was something unnerving about it, but Mark shook off the feeling. He stepped closer, reaching out to touch the puppet. As his fingers grazed the wood, a sudden chill ran through his body. He recoiled, stepping back, his heart pounding. The marionette hadn't moved, but he couldn't shake the sensation that it had. His rational mind fought against the unease, telling him it was just his imagination, but the oppressive silence in the room made him doubt. Mark decided to leave the puppet alone for now. Instead, he focused on searching through Holly's belongings, hoping to find some clue as to where she might have gone. As he sifted through her notes, he found sketches of Emmeline, diagrams of the marionette, and detailed descriptions of its movements. One passage caught his eye. "It's like she knows what I'm thinking. When I move her, it feels like she's controlling me, not the other way around. Sometimes I catch her looking at me, and I wonder if I should have left her in the attic, but I can't stop. I need to understand her." Mark's skin prickled as he read Holly's words. She had been experiencing something real. His curiosity deepened, despite the growing sense of dread gnawing at his stomach. That night, Mark decided to stay in the cottage. He was determined to uncover the truth, and he convinced himself that a night in the house would yield more answers. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the island, he settled in with Holly's journal, reading more about her descendant obsession. But as the hours passed, the house grew unnervingly quiet. The ticking of an old clock became deafening, and every creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of anxiety through Mark. He tried to focus on the pages in front of him, but his eyes kept drifting back to the marionette. It still sat on the shelf, motionless, but Mark could feel its presence. It was as though the puppet was silently waiting, biding its time. Just after midnight, a noise shattered the stillness. It was faint at first, like the sound of something scraping against wood. Mark froze, his heart racing. The noise grew louder, closer. It was coming from the corner of the room. Mark turned his head slowly, and his breath caught in his throat. The marionette was no longer on the shelf. It was standing in the middle of the room, its head tilted toward him, its black eyes gleaming in the dim light. For a moment, neither moved. Mark's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. This wasn't possible. Marionettes didn't move on their own. He told himself it had to be a trick, someone playing a cruel joke. But deep down, he knew. The marionette's limbs jerked forward, its wooden body creaking as it took a step. Mark's pulse pounded in his ears as he stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in his haste. The puppet's head tilted, its lifeless smile stretching wider. Mark ran. He bolted out of the room, his footsteps echoing through the cottage. Behind him, he could hear the faint sound of wood scraping against wood as the marionette followed. He raced up the stairs, slamming the door to one of the bedrooms behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pressed his back against the door, praying the thing wouldn't follow. But the silence that followed was worse. There were no footsteps, no creaking of wood, just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. After what felt like an eternity, Mark slowly opened the door, peering out into the hallway. There, standing at the foot of the stairs, was Emmeline. Her black eyes locked onto his. Mark screamed, slamming the door shut again. He could feel the weight of her gaze, a puppet's presence pressing against his mind like a vise. And then, in the darkness, he heard it, a voice. Soft, cold, and barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Thence, Mark felt his body begin to move, his limbs jerking against his will. He tried to fight it, but it was no use. Emmeline had him now, just as she had Holly, just as she had all the others before. And in that moment, Mark understood. The marionette was not a puppet at all. It was a parasite, feeding on the souls of those who dared to touch her strings, binding them to her will. The last thing Mark saw, before the darkness consumed him, was Emmeline's painted smile widening. And somewhere, deep inside the puppet, Holly watched. She watched as another soul joined her in the eternal dance. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had a great day.